El Chapo was basically put out there to have the spotlight so that he could cover for Mayo Zambada.
We're learning a major arrest was just made. This is quite the big kahuna here.
I'm not sure exactly what actually happened.
You know, we've heard a lot of rumors swirling right now. Seem to be scrambling for information about what happened, just like everyone else.
I'm sure you've all heard the news by now. The arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada isn't just another cartel takedown. It's the end of an era. The man behind the legend was so elusive and so powerful that for over 5 decades, he pulled the strings of one of the world's most notorious drug empires without ever seeing the inside of a jail cell. That is, until now. But here's where it gets wild. El Mayo's capture wasn't just a lucky break. It was an inside job that could make Hollywood scriptwriters jealous. Think about it. The son of El Mayo's former partner, the infamous El Chapo, turning on him? It's like a real-life crime thriller, and it's all going down right now as we speak. As we dig deeper into this story, you'll discover a web of betrayal, power struggles, and high-stakes gambling that goes far beyond anything you've heard on the news. We're about to take you on a journey into the dark heart of the drug world, where the line between allies and enemies is thinner than you could ever imagine. Ismael Zambada Garcia, better known as El Mayo, was never your typical drug lord. And now, at the ripe old age of 76, he's more like the godfather of godfathers, a true living legend in the narco world.
Mayo Zambada is worth close to $10 billion. And I'll remind you, that's a lot of money.
But he wasn't always a menacing figure. Born on January 1st, 1948, in a small village in Sinaloa, Mexico, El Mayo came from humble beginnings. But don't let that fool you. This guy climbed the ranks of the criminal underworld faster than his predecessors, and by the early 1970s, he was already making waves in the drug trade.
These guys were billionaires.
Yes,
Barely into their 30s.
that's correct.
Damn.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. While other cartel bosses were out there flashing their wealth and making headlines, El Mayo kept it low-key. Sure, everyone knew his name, but few had ever even seen his face. In fact, what you're looking at right now is one of the few confirmed pictures of El Mayo in existence prior to the events that unfolded on Tuesday.
We haven't really had a photo of this guy probably for 25 years.
Can you imagine being one of the most powerful criminals on the planet and still being able to grab a coffee at your local cafe without anyone batting an eye? That was El Mayo's superpower. But what made El Mayo truly unique was his longevity. In a world where cartel leaders often have the life expectancy of a mayfly, El Mayo managed to stay at the top for over 5 decades. It's a mix of brains, strategy, and a whole lot of caution.
The Sinaloa cartel is basically run by a person that nobody hears about, who's very discreet, and that's El Mayo Zambada.
Unlike his flashier counterparts, El Mayo preferred to operate from the shadows. He didn't have a fleet of gold-plated guns or a private zoo. Instead, he invested in what really mattered in the drug trade: connections. From corrupt politicians to rival gang members, El Mayo had a knack for making the right friends in all the wrong places. But don't mistake his low profile for weakness. El Mayo was known for his ruthlessness when it came to business.
Mayo Zambada had been running the cartel for a number of years, and they have a very strong bench. Very good leaders.
That's pretty high praise in a field that's not exactly known for its ethics awards. Now, let's talk about El Mayo's role in the Sinaloa cartel. Along with the now imprisoned Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, El Mayo co-founded what would become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history.
The cartel has been in existence since 1989 and is currently the most powerful drug cartel in the world. They operate in 6 of the 7 continents in the world.
And while El Chapo always was the face of the operation, getting caught, escaping, and generally living life like a narco rock star, El Mayo was the quiet power behind the throne. He was the strategist, the diplomat, the one who kept the machine running smoothly, while El Chapo was off tunneling his way out of maximum security prisons and attracting unwanted attention through his brutal way of doing business.
El Chapo was basically put out there to have the spotlight so that he could cover for Mayo Zambada. He is a sociopath that has no feelings, that can be basically hitting you with his right arm and eating a sandwich with his left hand.
And while that sounds overwhelming, El Chapo's merciless ways, combined with El Mayo's wits, was just what the Sinaloa cartel needed to secure their spot as the most lucrative drug cartel on the planet. Under their leadership, the Sinaloa cartel grew into a global empire. We're talking about an organization that at its peak was believed to be responsible for smuggling 25% of all illegal drugs entering the US from Mexico. That's not just big business, that's Amazon-level market domination. But El Mayo's influence went beyond just drugs. He was known as the engineer for his ability to build complex networks of corruption.
I'm talking about corrupt politicians. I'm talking about the money laundering cells, the enforcement cells, the logistical cells.
As we dive deeper into the story of El Mayo's arrest, keep this in mind. We're not just talking about the fall of a drug lord. We're witnessing the end of an era, the toppling of a criminal empire that has shaped the underworld for half a century. And trust me, the way it all went down is even more incredible than you might think. It's a sunny day in July 2024, and El Mayo, the man who's managed to evade capture for longer than some of you have been alive, is just going about his business. But little does he know, he's about to become the unwitting star of one of the most audacious sting operations in history.
We've heard a lot of rumors swirling right now that there was a setup, that he did surrender, and that this denial is a ruse.
Enter our unlikely hero, or should we say, anti-hero, Joaquin Guzman Lopez. Ring any bells? It should. He's the son of none other than El Chapo, El Mayo's former partner in crime. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't he supposed to be on El Mayo's side? Well, in the world of cartels, today's ally can be tomorrow's worst enemy.
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
It turns out that Guzman Lopez had been playing one dangerous double game. For months, he'd been in secret talks with US law enforcement, particularly a small team from the FBI and Homeland Security. Their goal? To bring down the last standing titan of the Sinaloa cartel. Now, let's pause for a second and appreciate the irony here. The son of El Chapo, the man who made headlines with his dramatic prison escapes, was now helping to capture his father's former partner. What's more, Guzman Lopez's own lawyer seems to be just as confused as the rest of us.
I'm not sure exactly what actually happened.
So, how did they pull it off? With a plan so audacious, it borders on the unbelievable. Allegedly, Guzman Lopez approached El Mayo with a proposition, a chance to inspect some new, clandestine airstrips in southern Mexico. For a man always looking to expand his empire, it must have seemed like a golden opportunity. El Mayo, the cautious old fox that he was, probably thought he had all his bases covered. After all, he was dealing with the son of his old partner. What could go wrong? As it turns out, everything. The private plane that was supposed to take El Mayo to these mythical airstrips had a slightly different flight plan. Instead of heading south into the heart of Mexico, it turned north. Destination, a small airport near El Paso, Texas.
This private airplane left the city of Hermosillo, Mexico around 8 o'clock this morning and yesterday morning, Thursday, and landed in El Paso a couple hours later. Both of these suspects were processed. We've seen photos of them.
Remember when I mentioned that we haven't seen a photo of this man for the better part of 2 decades? Well, now here it is, on full display for the world to see. And can you imagine the look on El Mayo's face when he realized what was happening? The man who had outsmarted authorities for decades, who had built an empire on his ability to stay one step ahead, had walked right into a trap. So, as the private plane touched down, it wasn't Mexican soil beneath its wheels, but American tarmac. And waiting on the ground wasn't a welcoming committee of cartel members, but a team of US federal agents ready to make the arrest of a lifetime. In a matter of moments, it was all over. The great El Mayo, the last of the old guard, was in handcuffs. Just like that, more than 50 years of evading justice came to an end. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Remember Guzman Lopez? Well, he wasn't just there to lure El Mayo. In a twist, he too was arrested alongside El Mayo. The man who had orchestrated this whole operation ended up in cuffs himself. Talk about a plot twist. It gets even trickier as Guzman Lopez's lawyer's initial confusion seemingly starts wearing off mid-press conference, and his version of events only adds to the mystery of what exactly transpired that day.
There has never been an agreement with the government with Joaquin Guzman Lopez. There is no agreement. Period.
You heard that right. Apparently, we're dealing with a mystery within a mystery, and all we can do right now is scratch our heads and wonder, But whichever narrative you choose to buy, there does seem to be a general consensus that this was an ambush.
It seems that there was some plan in advance hatched by Guzman. If the goal of Guzman and his henchmen was to eliminate El Mayo, then you'd think they could simply have killed him. The fact that they went through the effort of bringing him here to be prosecuted would suggest that Guzman has arranged for or is hoping for some sort of lenient treatment by the U.S. authorities.
So there you have it. The fall of El Mayo, brought about by an act of betrayal so bold, so unexpected, that it's sure to go down in the annals of criminal history. But as we'll see, this is just the beginning of the story. The ripple effects of this arrest are set to shake the foundations of the criminal underworld for years to come. And here's the kicker. El Mayo's lawyer is now even claiming that his client was forcibly kidnapped by Guzman Lopez.
I did speak to El Mayo's lawyer this morning, and he was adamant that his client did not surrender, did not come voluntarily.
According to the attorney, Frank Perez, El Mayo was ambushed, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed by 6 men in military uniforms. They allegedly tied his legs, put a black bag over his head, and threw him into the back of a pickup truck before forcing him onto the plane. Whether you believe this version of events or not, one thing's for sure. The capture of El Mayo Zambada marks the end of an era in the drug trade. As we delve deeper into this story, we'll explore the potential fallout from El Mayo's arrest, the power vacuum it might create, and what it means for the future of the drug trade. Let's start with the immediate aftermath. So we've got El Mayo, and he's now sitting in a U.S. courtroom, looking more like a frail grandfather than a cartel kingpin.
One of the world's most powerful drug cartel leaders appeared in a Texas federal court on Friday. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, leader of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, pleaded not guilty on all charges after being arrested by U.S. federal agents in Texas on Thursday.
But here's the kicker. He did it from a wheelchair. Talk about a fall from grace. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. El Mayo's arrest isn't just about one man. It's about the power vacuum he's left behind. This is a guy who's been at the top of the food chain for over 5 decades. So, what happens when you remove an apex predator from its ecosystem?
The concern is, however, that when you take out a top kingpin like this, that it creates a power vacuum and that there's fighting to sort of fill that and fill their shoes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Remember the Chapitos, El Chapo's sons? Apparently, they've been itching to take full control of the Sinaloa cartel for years. With El Mayo out of the picture, they might finally have their chance.
What I'm hearing so far from the state of Sinaloa is a lot of concern and fear that this is going to result in violence there.
But here's the thing. Not everyone in the cartel is thrilled about the idea of these young upstarts taking over. You see, El Mayo was old school. He believed in keeping a low profile and minimizing violence to avoid heat from the authorities. The Chapitos? Not so much. They're known for their flashy lifestyle and their willingness to use extreme violence to get what they want.
They fed their enemies alive to tigers, electrocuted them, waterboarded them, and shot them at close range with a .50 caliber machine gun.
Tonight, Mexican neighborhoods littered with bullet casings as dozens are dead in the wake of Ovidio's arrest.
It's like comparing a chess grandmaster to a group of guys who think the solution to every problem is flipping the board. And it's not just internal strife we need to worry about.
You also have a very, very powerful and very violent drug organization by the name of Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
The CJNG are probably licking their chops right now. They've been waiting for a chance to muscle in on Sinaloa territory, and El Mayo's arrest might be just the opening they need.
There's many others producing fentanyl and also amphetamines, synthetic drugs. And the cartels are starting to move into synthetic drugs. It's much cheaper to manufacture them. They make much more money.
But here's a twist that'll make your head spin. El Mayo's arrest might, in fact, not change much at all. Why? Because the Sinaloa cartel isn't just one man or even a group of men. It's a system, a well-oiled machine that's been running for decades.
I don't think that they will have any significant impact on the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel. And as an example, I will give to you exactly what happened when the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, Chapo Guzman, was extradited to the United States. had no impact.
So, what we're looking at here is a potential powder keg. Will the Sinaloa cartel implode in a blaze of internal conflict? Will rival cartels swoop in to claim territory? Or will it be business as usual, with new leaders stepping up to fill El Mayo's shoes? Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure, the Mexican drug trade is in for some turbulent times. Now, let's zoom out even further and look at the big picture. Because make no mistake, folks, the arrest of El Mayo Zambada isn't just about drugs and cartels. It's about geopolitics, public health crises, and the future of the war on drugs itself. First up, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Fentanyl. This synthetic opioid has been ravaging communities across the United States, and guess who's been one of the biggest suppliers? That's right, the Sinaloa cartel under El Mayo's leadership. Fentanyl overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. We're talking about a drug so potent, so deadly, that it's killing more young Americans than car accidents or gun violence.
Hospitals are forced to provide billions of dollars of uncompensated care. Fatal drugs like fentanyl are now flooding our streets.
But here's where it gets complicated. The Sinaloa cartel didn't just stumble into the fentanyl trade. They saw an opportunity and seized it. As we know, fentanyl is cheaper to produce than heroin, more potent, and doesn't require vast poppy fields that can be spotted by satellites. It's the perfect drug for cartels looking to maximize profits and minimize risk. So, while El Mayo's arrest might disrupt the supply chain in the short term, don't expect the fentanyl crisis to disappear overnight. As long as there's demand, someone will step up to supply it.
Que se expandió como una pandemia. O sea, empezó a haber gente muerta por aquí, por allá.
I've heard of people, but it's the first time they ever do it.
Now, let's talk politics. The timing of this arrest is interesting. It's election year in the US, and what better way to score points with voters than by taking down one of the world's most wanted drug lords? But it's not just US politics we need to consider. This arrest has sent shockwaves through the Mexican political establishment too. President Sheinbaum is demanding full transparency from the US about the operation. Having one of your country's most notorious criminals snatched from under your nose isn't a great look for any government.
It appears that Mexican authorities had no role in any of this operation. They have said so publicly and seem to be scrambling for information about what happened just like everyone else.
This brings us to a crucial question. What does El Mayo's arrest mean for US-Mexico relations? On the surface, it looks like a win for bilateral cooperation in the war on drugs.
The fact that the U.S. is, bringing these people to justice is pretty remarkable.
But dig a little deeper, and things get murky. The fact that Mexican authorities were kept in the dark about the operation speaks volumes. It suggests a lack of trust between the two countries' law enforcement agencies. And let's be real, given the history of corruption in Mexico's drug war, can you really blame the US for playing their cards close to the chest? But you can't really fight a transnational problem like drug trafficking without transnational cooperation. The arrest of El Mayo might be a short-term win, but if it damages US-Mexico relations in the long run, it could end up being a bittersweet victory. So, where do we go from here? Some experts are calling for a complete rethink of drug policy. They argue that the Kingpin strategy, taking out cartel leaders one by one, simply doesn't work. It creates power vacuums, sparks violent succession struggles, and does little to address the root causes of drug addiction and trafficking. Others say we need to double down, that El Mayo's arrest proves the strategy can work if we just push harder. It's a debate that's been raging for decades, and El Mayo's arrest has just added fuel to the fire. One thing's for sure, the war on drugs is far from over. El Mayo's arrest is a significant chapter, but it's not the end of the story. As we move forward, we'll need to grapple with tough questions about addiction, poverty, corruption, and international cooperation if we want to make real progress. It's crucial that we don't lose sight of the human cost behind all these headlines and power plays. Because at the end of the day, the drug trade isn't just about kingpins and cartels. It's about real people whose lives are irreversibly affected by this vicious cycle of supply and demand. For every high-profile arrest like El Mayo's, there are countless unnamed victims, ordinary people caught in the crossfire of cartel wars or silenced for daring to speak out. Journalists, politicians, police officers, and civilians. The cartels don't discriminate when it comes to eliminating threats or making examples. Then there are the addicts, the end users of the products El Mayo and his ilk peddle, people trapped in the grip of severe addiction, often stemming from prescription opioid abuse. Are we doing enough to address the root causes of drug addiction? Are we providing enough support for communities ravaged by cartel violence? Are we offering viable economic alternatives to those who might otherwise be drawn into the drug trade? These are tough questions without easy answers, but they're questions we need to grapple with if we want to make real, lasting progress in the war on drugs. The arrest of El Mayo Zambada is undoubtedly a significant moment in the history of the drug war. It's a testament to the dedication of law enforcement agencies and a blow to one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. But it's also a reminder of how much work still lies ahead. The war isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning.
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
You think they could simply have killed him.
Rivals start to move in, and it gets extremely bloody.
If I was a betting man, I'd bet on him getting away with this.
El Mayo Zambada, the legendary leader of the Sinaloa cartel, has finally broken his silence. After months of speculation, the man who evaded capture for over half a century is now telling his side of the story. And what a story it is. In a shocking twist, El Mayo now claims he was kidnapped by none other than El Chapo's son, Joaquin Guzman Lopez. So this wasn't some daring escape or clever DEA operation. It was an inside job that goes deeper than anyone could have imagined. But why would El Chapo's own flesh and blood turn on his father's longtime partner? What drove Guzman Lopez to betray one of the most powerful figures in the criminal underworld? And can we trust El Mayo's version of events? This story is about to challenge everything you thought you knew about the fall of El Mayo Zambada. It's a warm July morning in 2024, and a sleek private jet is cruising over northern Mexico. On board is Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the 76-year-old kingpin of the Sinaloa cartel. He thinks he's on his way to a routine business meeting to inspect some new landing strips for his many operations. Sitting across from him is Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of the sons of the now imprisoned El Chapo. It's clear now that this plane is basically carrying Sinaloa royalty. However, Guzman seems nervous. Does he know something he's not sharing? And is this really the routine business meeting El Mayo has been led to believe? The plane touches down on a small, nondescript airstrip. El Mayo stands up, straightening his signature cowboy hat. He's expecting to be greeted by some local officials, maybe even the governor of Sinaloa himself. That's what he was told, anyway. Instead, as the cabin door swings open, El Mayo is confronted by a sight that makes his blood run cold. Standing on the tarmac is a group of heavily armed men in tactical gear. In that moment, El Mayo realizes he's been set up. The first thing they do is grab El Mayo, leaving little room for interpretation. This is in fact an ambush. And just like that, the long reign of El Mayo comes to an abrupt and inglorious end. Now, this is where El Mayo's version of events diverges sharply from the official story. According to his lawyer, Frank Perez, El Mayo was not just arrested, he was kidnapped.
El Mayo says, I did not turn myself in and I did not come voluntarily to the United States, nor did I have an agreement with either government. To the contrary, I was kidnapped and brought to the U.S. forcefully and against my will.
This bombshell statement, released just days after his arrest, has thrown this entire operation into question. But El Mayo is not done yet. He goes on to provide even more details about his alleged abduction.
He also says he was ambushed by a group of men who assaulted him, adding he was subjected to physical abuse and forced into a private plane that came straight to El Paso, where U.S. federal authorities were waiting for him.
If these allegations are true, they paint a picture of a brutal betrayal orchestrated by Guzman Lopez. But why would El Chapo's son turn on El Mayo? To understand that, we need to look at the changing dynamics within the Sinaloa cartel. After El Chapo's arrest and extradition, there was a power struggle brewing. On one side, you had El Mayo and his faction. On the other, you had Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, including Guzman Lopez. The old guard, represented by El Mayo, was clashing with the new blood of Los Chapitos.
And the Chapitos, like their father, they like the glory, they like being glorified in narco corridos, and the spotlight is on them.
This stark difference in approach was causing serious tension within the cartel. El Mayo, known for his low-key style, was increasingly at odds with the flashier, more aggressive tactics of the Los Chapitos, but taking on El Mayo directly would have been almost impossible. Think about it this way. The man had connections that ran deep, and people under his command were as loyal as they could possibly get. So, Guzman Lopez had to be smart about it. And what's smarter than turning your enemy over to the authorities and coming out looking like a hero? However, Guzman Lopez's plan, if that's indeed what it was, didn't quite go as expected. In a twist that no one saw coming, he ended up in handcuffs right alongside El Mayo.
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
This unexpected turn of events has led to speculation that Guzman Lopez was playing an even longer game. Some experts believe that by turning himself in, along with El Mayo, he might have been hoping to strike a deal with the U.S. authorities.
The fact that they went through the effort of bringing him here to be prosecuted would suggest that Guzman has arranged for or is hoping for some sort of lenient treatment by the U.S. authorities.
But here's where it gets confusing. If the story would end here, it would be a pretty straightforward narrative, right? Well, when it comes to what actually happened inside that plane that day, not everyone seems to be on the same page. Guzman Lopez's own lawyer tells an entirely different story. According to him, there was no deal and no agreement with the authorities.
There has never been an agreement with the government with Joaquin Guzman Lopez. There is no agreement. Period.
And as if this dramatic plot twist wasn't enough, El Mayo's allegations of kidnapping have thrown a wrench into the legal proceedings. Now, U.S. authorities, for their part, have remained tight-lipped about the specifics of the operation. But this silence has only fueled more speculation and conspiracy theories. Adding to the intrigue is the reaction of the Mexican government itself. They claim they were completely in the dark about this operation, raising some pretty serious questions about things like international cooperation.
It appears that Mexican authorities had no role in any of this operation. They have said so publicly. And seem to be scrambling for information about what happened, just like everyone else. You know, the U.S. has worked hand in hand over the years with Mexico, but that relationship has become more difficult over the years.
Think about it. El Mayo, cruel as he may be, is still a Mexican citizen, and critics argue that the U.S. meddled in what should have been Mexico's internal affairs. But no matter how you spin it, this lack of communication between the U.S. and Mexico is troubling, to say the least. If this was a legitimate law enforcement operation, why keep the Mexican authorities out of the loop? And if it wasn't, well, that opens up a whole new can of worms. Some experts are even suggesting that this whole operation might have been part of a larger power play within the Mexican government itself. After all, El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with the governor of Sinaloa. If that's true, it suggests a level of high-level cooperation that goes way beyond your typical law enforcement operation.
Mark this. The Mexican government is complicit in these drug cartel organizations, no question about it.
This explosive claim isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. The level of corruption that's been exposed in Mexican law enforcement and politics over the years makes such a scenario disturbingly plausible. Could it be that certain factions within the Mexican government saw El Mayo as a liability and decided to get rid of him? Or was this a genuine attempt by honest officials to bring down one of the biggest players in the global drug trade? The truth is, we may never know the full story, but one thing's for sure. The arrest of El Mayo Zambada has opened up a Pandora's box of questions about the relationship between cartels, governments, and law enforcement on both sides of the border. Let's take a step back and look at who El Mayo really is. This isn't just any run-of-the-mill drug lord we're talking about. Ismael Zambada Garcia is a legend in the narco world, a man who managed to build and maintain a criminal empire for nearly half a century, pretty much undefeated. But as astonishing as that might sound, what made El Mayo truly stand out from the rest was his elusiveness.
We haven't really had a photo of this guy probably for 25 years.
It's easy to see why most people, including Jack Riley, also known as the former head of the DEA, thought El Mayo could very well evade justice forever.
If I was a betting man, I'd bet on him getting away with this.
So how did this master of evasion end up in handcuffs? The answer to that question depends on who you ask. According to the official story, it was a brilliant sting operation, months in the making. But El Mayo's version paints a very different picture, one of betrayal, violence, and potentially illegal actions by law enforcement. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but wherever it lies, the consequences consequences of El Mayo's arrest are likely to be far-reaching and potentially devastating. Let's consider the potential fallout for a moment. The Sinaloa cartel isn't just going to roll over and call it quits now that El Mayo's gone. There are plenty of ambitious underlings ready to step up and claim the throne.
The concern is, however, that when you take out a top kingpin like this, that it creates a power vacuum and that there's fighting to sort of fill that and fill their shoes.
This power vacuum could lead to a wave of violence as different factions within the cartel vie for control. And it's not just internal strife we need to worry about. Rival cartels might see this as an opportunity to move in on Sinaloa territory. Chris Swecker, a former FBI official, gives us a pretty scary prediction of what might be coming.
Typically, when you make a high-level arrest like this is one of the top leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo's organization. Things tend to get violent, even more violent than they are normally, and violence is the norm in Mexico. So when you take off a top cartel leader, they start, the other leaders start vying for power, rivals start to move in, and it gets extremely bloody.
Plus, it's not just Mexico that needs to be worried. The potential for violence isn't limited to south of the border. The Sinaloa cartel has tentacles that reach deep into the United States.
Now we have open borders, and despite the most recent executive action, the cartels, the open borders have enabled the cartels to become the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. They are making billions and billions, and the open border did nothing but enable them. And they have infiltrated into the United States even more so than they did before. And there's no way to put this toothpaste back in the tube.
Cities could see an uptick in violence as different factions vie for control of distribution networks. The instability in Mexico could lead to an increase in other criminal activities that directly impact the U.S. We're talking about human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and money laundering on a massive scale. But perhaps the most insidious impact is one we can't easily see or measure: the corruption of American institutions. If the cartels are indeed as deeply embedded in the U.S. as some experts fear, we could see attempts to influence local politics, compromise law enforcement, and infiltrate legitimate businesses. It's a threat not just to public safety, but to the very foundations of our democracy. One thing is clear, however: the fall of El Mayo Zambada isn't just a Mexican problem. It's a crisis that could have far-reaching consequences for communities all across the United States. And addressing this crisis will require a level of international cooperation that, so far, has proven unattainable. Now that we've explored the immediate fallout of El Mayo's arrest, let's dive deeper into the potential long-term consequences of this seismic event in the narco world, because the ripple effects of El Mayo's fall are likely to be felt far beyond the borders of Mexico for years to come. One of the most pressing concerns is how this will affect the balance of power within the cartel world. With El Mayo gone, who's going to step up to fill his shoes? Will it be Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, who've been itching to take full control of the cartel? Or will rival organizations see this as their chance to move in on Sinaloa territory?
Why prepare? Because it's not clear what happened. There could be a different response from criminal groups if it was a surrender or a betrayal between cells of the same cartel.
This uncertainty is creating an extremely tense atmosphere in the cartel world. Everyone's waiting to see who will make the first move, and when they do, it's likely to set off a chain reaction of violence. One thing's for sure: the next few months are going to be crucial, and if history has taught us anything, it's that transitions of power in the cartel world are rarely peaceful. We could be looking at a full-blown cartel war that makes previous conflicts look like playground scuffles. But let's not forget about the broader implications of El Mayo's arrest. If his claims of kidnapping are true, it raises some serious questions about the methods being used in the war on drugs. Are law enforcement agencies resorting to illegal tactics in their desperation to catch high-level targets? And if so, what does that mean for the integrity of the justice system? These are not just abstract legal questions. They have real-world consequences. If El Mayo's arrest is found to be illegal, it could potentially invalidate the entire case against him. That would be a massive blow to law enforcement efforts and could embolden other cartel leaders. Moreover, the alleged involvement of El Chapo's son in this operation adds yet another layer of complexity to the entire situation. If Guzman Lopez did indeed betray El Mayo, it could signal a major shift in cartel dynamics. Are we seeing the end of the old alliances and the beginning of a new, more ruthless era in the drug trade? And let's also consider the international implications of this event. The fact that Mexican authorities claim they were kept in the dark about this operation is troubling. to say the least. It suggests a breakdown in communication between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies, which could have serious consequences for future anti-drug efforts.
When you have those volumes of money that are associated with the drug traffic coming through a relatively a still developing country like Mexico, it does create enormous distortions in the system. And so in that sense, a trajectory of escalating violence, increasing corruption, a direct challenge to political authority.
If high-level government officials were indeed involved in El Mayo's alleged kidnapping, it would just go on to prove just how deep this corruption truly runs. The arrest of El Mayo Zambada isn't just about one man, it's about the potential fall of an empire. The Sinaloa Cartel, under El Mayo's leadership, was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. We're talking about a group that at its peak was believed to be responsible for smuggling 25% of all illegal drugs entering the US from Mexico. So when a man like this falls, it sends shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. But here's where it gets interesting. Some experts believe that El Mayo's arrest might not change much at all. Why? Because the Sinaloa Cartel isn't just one man or even a group of men. It's a system, a well-oiled machine that's been running for decades.
I don't think that they will have any significant impact on the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel. And as an example, I will give to you exactly what happened when the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, Chapo Guzman, was extradited to the United States. Had no impact.
This perspective suggests that the cartel has become so entrenched and so institutionalized that it can basically continue to function even without its top leadership. It's a pretty grim thought, and one that raises some serious questions about the effectiveness of the Kingpin strategy in the war on drugs. So, what we're looking at here is a potential bomb waiting to explode. Will the Sinaloa cartel implode in a blaze of internal conflict? Will rival cartels swoop in to claim territory? Or will it be business as usual, with new leaders stepping up to fill El Mayo's shoes? Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure, the Mexican drug trade is in for some turbulent times. Let's circle back to El Mayo's claims of kidnapping. If true, these allegations could have serious legal implications. In the world of international law, the manner in which a suspect is brought to trial can sometimes be as important as the charges themselves. If it can be proven that El Mayo was indeed kidnapped and brought to the US against his will, it could potentially violate the extradition treaty between the US and Mexico. This could, in theory, lead to the case against him being thrown out. But even if the case proceeds, El Mayo's claims have already cast a shadow of doubt over the entire operation. They've raised questions about the tactics being used in the war on drugs and the level of cooperation, or lack thereof, between US and Mexican authorities. This lack of coordination is troubling. Effective international cooperation is crucial in the fight against transnational criminal organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel. If US and Mexican authorities can't work together effectively, it gives the cartels a significant advantage. But let's not forget about the role of corruption in all of this. The sad reality is that drug money has a way of finding its way into official pockets on both sides of the border. And let's also consider the potential consequences of El Mayo's arrest on the drug trade itself. Some experts believe that taking out top leaders like El Mayo can actually lead to an increase in violence and drug trafficking in the short term. The reasoning goes like this. When a major leader falls, it creates a power vacuum. Lower-level members of the organization start vying for power, often violently. At the same time, rival cartels see an opportunity to move in on territory. The result is often a spike in violence. Moreover, in the chaos that follows a major arrest, drug production and trafficking can actually increase. Different factions within the cartel may ramp up their operations in an attempt to prove their worth and claim leadership. All of this means that paradoxically, the arrest of El Mayo could lead to more drugs on American streets in the short term. It's a sobering reminder of just how complex and challenging the war on drugs really is. But what about the long term? Can the arrest of figures like El Mayo make a difference in the grand scheme of things? Opinions are divided on this point. Some argue that the Kingpin strategy, focusing on taking out top leaders, is ultimately ineffective. They point out that new leaders always seem to emerge to take the place of those who fall. Others maintain that these high-profile arrests do have value. They disrupt cartel operations, even if only temporarily, and send a message that no one is beyond the reach of the law. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. While arresting cartel leaders is undoubtedly important, it's clear that a more comprehensive approach is needed to truly tackle the problem of drug trafficking. This might include addressing the root causes of drug addiction, improving economic opportunities in areas where cartels recruit, and finding ways to reduce the profitability of the drug trade. It's a pretty difficult task, to be sure, but the alternative, allowing these powerful criminal organizations to continue operating with impunity, is simply not acceptable. As we wrap up our exploration of El Mayo's arrest and its potential consequences, we're left with more questions than answers. What will happen to the individuals arrested that day? Will their removal from the streets lead to a decrease in violence? Or will others simply step up to take their place? And what about the broader community? How can they be supported and empowered to resist the lure of cartel life? These are complex questions with no easy answers. But here's the thing, the battle against cartel violence is far from over. It will take the combined efforts of law enforcement, community leaders, and residents themselves to create lasting change. The fall of El Mayo Zambada isn't just the end of a kingpin's reign, it's the final curtain on an entire era of the drug trade. But as one chapter closes, another now begins, and this one's being written in real time, with ink still wet and the ending far from certain. Will the next act be a bloodbath of cartel violence, or could it be the opening scene of a radical new approach to the war on drugs?
We're learning a major arrest was just made.
He was ambushed by a group of men who assaulted him.
You think they could simply have killed him.
I'm not sure exactly what actually happened.
Jorge, is El Mayo speaking out?
You've probably heard about the arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada by now, the man who managed to stay one step ahead of the law for over half a century, the last of the old-school narco bosses, finally in custody. It's huge news, no doubt about it. But here's the thing. This story isn't as straightforward as it seems. Everyone's been wondering how a man who managed to evade justice for so long got caught so easily, and rightly so, given the fact, well, it turns out there might have been some serious betrayal going on. We're talking about allegations of ambush, kidnapping, and a plot so twisted that it's hard to tell who is even telling the truth. As we unravel this mystery, we'll explore claims that have everyone from drug lords to government officials pointing fingers.
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
Was El Mayo really outsmarted, or was he the victim of an elaborate setup? And who's really pulling the strings in this high-stakes game of cat and mouse? It all started on a sunny day in July 2024. El Mayo, the man who's managed to stay off the radar for longer than some of us have even been alive, is just going about his business. Maybe he's sipping on a cold cerveza, thinking about his next move in the never-ending chess game of the drug trade. Little does he know, he's about to become the unwitting star of one of the most audacious sting operations in history. Now, before we dive into what went down that day, let's take a moment to appreciate just who we're dealing with here. Ismael El Mayo Zambada isn't your run-of-the-mill drug lord. This guy's a living legend in the narco world. At 76 years old, he'd managed to stay at the top of the game for 5 whole decades without ever seeing the inside of a jail cell. Can you imagine that? While other cartel bosses were getting caught, escaping, and generally living life like narco rock stars, El Mayo was the quiet power behind the throne.
The Sinaloa cartel is basically run by a person that nobody hears about, who's very discreet, and that's El Mayo Zambada.
This pretty much sums up El Mayo's whole strategy. While guys like El Chapo were making headlines with dramatic prison escapes, El Mayo was the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But here's where it gets interesting. On that fateful day in July, El Mayo's legendary caution seems to have failed him. If you were to believe the official story, he boarded a private plane, thinking he was off to inspect some new territory. Instead, he ended up in handcuffs on American soil. Talk about a bad day at the office, right?
This private airplane left the city of Hermosillo, Mexico around 8 o'clock this morning and landed, yesterday morning, Thursday, and landed in El Paso a couple hours later. Both of these suspects were processed. We've seen photos of them.
Now, I don't know about you, but something about this story just doesn't add up. How does a man who's been outsmarting authorities for half a century suddenly fall for such a simple trick? It's like finding out that Houdini passed while trying to escape from a pair of handcuffs. It just doesn't make sense. And that's where things start to get really juicy. You see, El Mayo isn't taking this lying down. Through his lawyer, he's making some pretty wild accusations. He's saying he didn't just get tricked, he's now saying that he got straight up kidnapped. According to El Mayo's version of events, he was ambushed after being led to believe he was attending a meeting with the governor of Sinaloa, Ruben Rocha Moya. Now, imagine that for a second. You're expecting to sit down with a high-ranking government official, and the next thing you know, you're being thrown onto a plane bound for the US. El Mayo must have been shocked, to say the least. But why don't we take a look at that El Mayo had to say about his whole ordeal? He certainly didn't mince words in his statement from prison, that's for sure. To the contrary, I was kidnapped and brought to the US forcibly and against my will. Now, that's a pretty serious accusation. We're not just talking about a clever sting operation anymore. If what El Mayo's saying is true, we're looking at a potential international incident. But wait, it gets even crazier. El Mayo claims that when he arrived at the supposed meeting spot, he was confronted by men in military uniforms. These guys allegedly threw him to the ground, put a hood over his head, and bundled him onto the plane. It's like something out of a spy thriller, isn't it? Now, you might be thinking, come on, this sounds too wild to be true. And you'd be right to be skeptical. After all, El Mayo's not exactly known for his honesty. But here's the thing. Some pretty credible sources are backing up his story, at least partially. Take the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Ken Salazar. He's gone on record saying, the evidence we saw suggests he was brought to the U.S. against his will. So when a high-ranking diplomat is lending credence to a drug lord's kidnapping claims, you know something fishy is going on. But the plot thickens even further. Remember how we talked about betrayal earlier? Well, this is where things get really twisted. Who is the mastermind behind this whole operation? Allegedly, it was none other than Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of El Mayo's former partner, the infamous El Chapo. Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking about the son of El Mayo's old buddy potentially setting him up. It's like a real-life version of The Godfather, only with more drugs and fewer cannolis. Now, let's talk about Guzman Lopez for a second. This guy's no small-time player. He's part of the next generation of cartel leadership, the so-called Los Chapitos, who've been making waves in the narco world.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the four most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines.
But here's the kicker. On that fateful day of July 25th, Joaquin Guzman Lopez ended up in cuffs right alongside El Mayo. That's right, the guy who allegedly set up this whole operation got arrested too. But why would Guzman Lopez set himself up like that? Well, that's where things get really interesting. Some people are speculating that he's hoping for a sweetheart deal from the US government.
If the goal of Guzman and his henchmen was to eliminate El Mayo, then you think they could simply have killed him. The fact that they went through the effort of bringing him here to be prosecuted would suggest that Guzman has arranged for or is hoping for some sort of lenient treatment by the US authorities.
It's a theory that makes a certain kind of sense. After all, if you're going to take down one of the biggest fish in the cartel world, why not try to get something out of it for yourself? But here's where we need to put on our detective hats and start asking some hard questions. If Guzman Lopez was working with the US authorities, why did he end up arrested? Was this part of the plan all along, a way to maintain his cover, or did something go wrong?
You know, we've heard a lot of rumors swirling right now that and seem to be scrambling for information about what happened, just like everyone else.
And what about the Mexican government's role in all this? El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with the governor of Sinaloa. Was this just a story he cooked up, or was there some truth to it? Could there be high-level Mexican officials involved in this plot? It's a tangled web, and we're only just starting to unravel it. But one thing's for sure, the more we dig into this story, the more questions we uncover. Now, let's take a step back and consider the bigger picture for a moment. The arrest of El Mayo Zambada isn't just about one man. It's about the fall of an empire. The Sinaloa Cartel, under El Mayo's leadership, was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. We're talking about a group that at its peak was believed to be responsible for smuggling 25% of all illegal drugs entering the US from Mexico. That's a lot of money coming in.
El Mayo Zambada is worth close to $10 billion. And I'll remind you, that's a lot of money. There's 1,000 million and 1 billion.
So when a man like this falls, it sends shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. It's like if Apple suddenly lost its CEO and half its board of directors in one day. You'd expect some pretty major upheaval, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing now. In the wake of El Mayo's arrest, there are reports of increased violence and tension in cartel-controlled areas. It's like a game of narco musical chairs, with everyone scrambling to grab territory and power before the music stops.
Rivals start to move in and it gets extremely bloody.
That's how one former FBI agent describes the situation, and it's a chilling prediction of what the future might have in store. We're not just talking about a temporary spike in violence. We could be looking at a full-blown cartel war that could turn the streets of Mexico into a real battleground. But here's where it gets really scary. This violence isn't likely to stay contained within Mexico's borders. As the cartels fight for control of drug routes and territory, we could actually see spillover into the United States. Remember, these organizations already have extensive networks in American cities. A full-blown cartel war could turn those cities into battlegrounds.
You will see people hanging from overpasses, beheadings.
It's a pretty horrific picture, isn't it? And it's all stemming from this one arrest. It really drives home just how big a player El Mayo was in the narco world. But let's circle back to the circumstances of his arrest, because the more we look at it, the more questions we have. If El Mayo really was kidnapped, as he claims, what does that say about the state of law enforcement in Mexico? Are we looking at a case of the ends justify the means, where authorities were willing to break the law to catch a bigger criminal? And what about the US government's role in all this? If they knew El Mayo was brought to the country against his will, does that make them complicit in an international kidnapping? It's a legal and ethical minefield that could have serious repercussions for US-Mexico relations. Speaking of which, let's talk about how this whole affair is playing out on the diplomatic stage. The Mexican government, unsurprisingly, isn't too happy about one of their citizens being snatched up and whisked across the border.
It appears that Mexican authorities had no role in any of this operation. They have said so publicly.
After all, not being able to capture one of your most prolific criminals for the better part of 5 whole decades isn't a good look for any government.
You know, the U.S. has worked hand in hand over the years with Mexico, but that relationship has become more difficult over the years.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Some experts are suggesting that elements within the Mexican government might have been in on the plan all along. After all, El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with a governor. So, if that's true, it suggests certain degree of high-level cooperation that goes way beyond your typical law enforcement operation. So, where does this leave us? Well, we're left with more questions than answers, that's for sure. Was El Mayo really kidnapped? Or is this just the last desperate claim of a man facing life in prison? If he was kidnapped, who was really behind it? The US government, Mexican officials, or rival cartels? And what about Guzman Lopez? What was his role in all this? And why did he end up arrested alongside El Mayo? Is he a criminal mastermind, a government informant, or just a pawn in a game much bigger than himself? As we dig deeper into this story, we'll explore these questions and more. We'll look at the potential fallout from El Mayo's arrest, both in terms of cartel violence and international relations. We'll examine the changing landscape of the drug trade and what it might mean for communities on both sides of the border. But most importantly, we'll try to unravel the truth behind one of the most intriguing arrests in cartel history. Because make no mistake, the story of El Mayo's capture is far from over. In fact, we're probably just getting started. Now that we've set the stage with El Mayo's dramatic arrest and the swirling allegations surrounding it, let's dive deeper into the potential consequences of this seismic event in the narco world. Because the ripple effects of El Mayo's fall are likely to be felt far beyond the borders of Mexico. First up, let's talk about the power vacuum left in the wake of El Mayo's arrest. Nature abhors a vacuum, and in the world of drug cartels, that vacuum tends to get filled pretty quickly. and violently.
What I'm hearing so far from the state of Sinaloa is a lot of concern and fear that this is going to result in violence there.
That's the word from sources on the ground, and it's not hard to see why they're worried. The Sinaloa cartel isn't just going to roll over and call it quits now that El Mayo's gone. There are plenty of ambitious underlings ready to step up and claim the throne. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo? These guys have been itching to take full control of the cartel for years. With El Mayo out of the picture, they might finally have their chance.
And the Chapitos, like their father, they like the glory, they like being glorified in narco corridos, and the spotlight is on them.
That's a stark contrast to El Mayo's low-key approach, isn't it? And it could signal a major shift in how the Sinaloa cartel operates. We might be looking at a new era of flashy narco bosses who are more than happy to flaunt their wealth and power. But here's the thing, not everyone in the cartel is thrilled about the idea of Los Chapitos taking over. El Mayo was old school. He believed in keeping a low profile and minimizing violence to avoid heat from the authorities. The Chapitos, well, let's just say they have a different approach.
They fed their enemies alive to tigers, electrocuted them, waterboarded them, and shot them at close range with a .50 caliber machine gun.
That's right. These guys make their dad look like a choir boy in comparison, and their rise to power could trigger a wave of violence that makes previous cartel wars look like playground scuffles. But Los Chapitos aren't the only players in this game. There's also the possibility that someone from El Mayo's inner circle could step up. Remember, this is a man who built an empire on connections and loyalty. It's entirely possible that he's been grooming a successor that we don't even know about yet. And let's not forget about rival cartels. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, has been nipping at Sinaloa's heels for years. They might see El Mayo's arrest as their chance to make a big move.
You also have a very, very powerful and very violent drug organization by the name of Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
If the CJNG decides to make a play for Sinaloa territory, we could be looking at a cartel war of unprecedented scale. And guess who gets caught in the crossfire? Innocent civilians, that's who. What's even more concerning is that the fallout from this power struggle might end up being felt far beyond the borders of Mexico. Let's start with the obvious, the drugs. Under El Mayo's leadership, the Sinaloa cartel was one of the biggest suppliers of fentanyl to the United States. And with the cartel leadership now blown into bits, that crisis could get even worse.
Hospitals are forced to provide billions of dollars of uncompensated care. Fatal drugs like fentanyl are now flooding our streets.
In times of instability, cartels often ramp up production and trafficking to secure their position. We could see a flood of drugs hitting American streets as different factions try to assert their dominance. And in the chaos, quality control, as much as it exists in illegal drugs, could go out the window, leading to even more potent and dangerous substances. But it's not just about drugs. The instability in Mexico could lead to an increase in other criminal activities that directly impact the U.S. We're talking about human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and money laundering on a massive scale.
Now we have open borders, and despite the most recent executive action, the cartels, the open borders have enabled the cartels to become the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. They are making billions and billions, and the open border did nothing but enable them. And they have infiltrated into the United States even more so than they did before. And there's no way to put this toothpaste back in the tube.
This infiltration isn't just happening in border states. Cartel networks extend deep into the heartland of America. Cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and even New York could see an uptick in violence as different factions vie for control of distribution networks. And let's not forget about the potential for spillover violence as the cartels fight it out in Mexico. It's not hard to imagine some of that violence crossing the border. We could see assassinations, kidnappings, and other violent crimes increase in American cities with strong cartel presence. But perhaps the most insidious impact is one we can't easily see or measure: the corruption of American institutions. If the cartels are indeed as deeply embedded in the U.S. as some experts fear, we could see attempts to influence local politics, compromise law enforcement, and infiltrate legitimate businesses. It's a threat not just to public safety, but to the very foundations of our democracy. Now, let's circle back to El Mayo himself for a moment, because even as we're discussing the potential fallout from his arrest, there are still so many unanswered questions about how it all went down. One of the most intriguing aspects of this case is the alleged involvement of Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son. If he really did set up El Mayo, as some are claiming, what was his endgame? Was he hoping to take over the cartel himself? Or was he working with authorities in hopes of a reduced sentence?
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
It's a question that's been puzzling investigators and cartel watchers alike, and the answer could shed light on a whole new level of intrigue within the narco world. But wait, there's another twist in this already convoluted tale. Guzman Lopez's lawyer is adamantly denying any deal with the authorities. In fact, he's painting a picture that's completely at odds with the idea of his client being some sort of mastermind or informant.
We've got no agreement with the government. There has never been an agreement with the government with Joaquin Guzman Lopez. There is no agreement, period. That's it.
That's a pretty unequivocal statement, isn't it? But it gets even more intriguing. The lawyer goes on to say,
I'm not sure exactly what actually happened.
Now, that's not exactly the kind of certainty you'd expect from someone defending a client accused of orchestrating such a high-profile arrest. And it sounds like Guzman Lopez's own legal team is as in the dark about what really went down as the rest of us. So where does this leave us? With even more questions. That's where. If Guzman Lopez wasn't working with the authorities, how did he end up on that plane with El Mayo? And if he wasn't the mastermind behind this operation, who was? But here's where it gets even more interesting. Some experts are speculating that this whole operation might have been part of a larger power play within the Mexican government itself.
But mark this. The Mexican government is complicit in these drug cartel organizations. No question about it.
That's a pretty explosive claim, isn't it? But when you consider the level of corruption that's been exposed in Mexican law enforcement and politics over the years, it's not entirely far-fetched. Could it be that certain factions within the Mexican government saw El Mayo as a liability and decided to get rid of him? Or was this a genuine attempt by honest officials to bring down one of the biggest players in the drug trade? The truth is, we may never know the full story. But one thing's for sure, the arrest of El Mayo Zambada has opened up a Pandora's box of questions about the relationship between cartels, governments, and law enforcement on both sides of the border. So, where do we go from here? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The challenges ahead are daunting, to say the least. We're looking at the potential for increased violence in Mexico, a flood of drugs into the US, and the possibility of cartel influence spreading even further into American institutions. But it's not all doom and gloom. The arrest of El Mayo, as fraught with potential consequences as it is, also represents an opportunity. It's a chance to reassess our approach to the war on drugs, to strengthen international cooperation, and to address the root causes of the drug trade. One thing's for sure, the old strategies aren't working. The Kingpin approach, where authorities focus on taking down cartel leaders, has been shown time and time again to have limited effectiveness.
I don't think that they will have any significant impact on the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel. And as an example, I will give to you exactly what happened when the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, Chapo Guzman, was extradited to the United States. Had no impact.
So, is it time to consider alternative approaches? Should the US be looking at decriminalization or even legalization as a way to take the profit out of the drug trade? It's a controversial idea, to be sure, but with the current strategies failing to make a dent in the problem, it's one that's gaining traction in some circles. And what about addressing the root causes of the drug trade? Poverty, lack of economic opportunities, and weak institutions all contribute to the power of the cartels. Maybe it's time for a Marshall Plan for Mexico and Central America, focusing on economic development and strengthening democratic institutions. Of course, none of these solutions are easy or quick fixes. They require long-term commitment, significant resources, and a level of international cooperation that's often been lacking in the past. But as we've seen with the arrest of El Mayo Zambada, the current approach is like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. We're treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying disease. As we wrap up our deep dive into the arrest of El Mayo Zambada and its potential consequences, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the human cost of this ongoing crisis. For every cartel leader arrested, There are thousands of lives ruined by addiction, violence, and poverty.
I don't want that to happen to anybody else. I'm devastated, I'm heartbroken, I'm shattered.
That's the voice of a parent who lost a child to fentanyl, and it's a reminder of the real stakes in this fight. It's not just about geopolitics or law enforcement statistics. It's about real people, real families whose lives are being torn apart by this endless cycle of violence and addiction. So, as we move forward from El Mayo's arrest, let's keep that human cost in mind. Let's remember that behind every headline about cartel violence or drug busts, there are countless personal tragedies unfolding. The fall of El Mayo Zambada marks the end of an era in the drug trade, but it also marks the beginning of a new chapter, one that's yet to be written. The choices made in the coming months and years will determine whether this chapter is one of continued violence and suffering, or whether it's the beginning of a new approach to a problem that has plagued our societies for far too long. As we sign off, we're left with a few questions that need answering. Given what you've learned about El Mayo's arrest and its potential fallout, what do you think should be the top priority for law enforcement and policymakers moving forward? Is it cracking down harder on the cartels, focusing on corruption, or taking a completely new approach to the war on drugs? Feel free to share your thoughts down in the comment section below. And if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, stay safe